True crime in the digital night.
The road out of Nebraska was white with winter and fear. By the end of January 1958, Charles Starkweather and Caril Ann Fugate were no longer just two young people in a stolen car. They were a moving panic. Their names passed from police radios to newspapers, from newspapers to kitchen tables, from kitchen tables to children told not to open the door for anyone. In Lincoln, Nebraska, families had been found murdered in their homes. On rural roads, teenagers had been killed. In Wyoming, the chase was coming apart under the open sky. Starkweather was 19 years old, red-haired, angry, and desperate to be remembered. He had built himself out of grievance, movie star fantasy, and the belief that humiliation could be answered with blood. Caril Fugate was 14. That number matters. 14 years old. A child by any humane measure, but old enough in the eyes of the law and the newspapers to be transformed into something darker. Accomplice, girlfriend, monster, victim, liar, legend. 11 people were dead. Robert Colvert, Marion Bartlett, Velda Bartlett, Betty Jean Bartlett, August Meyer, Robert Jensen, Carol King, Lillian Fenkel, Clara Ward, C. Lauer Ward, Merle Collison, and when the killing stopped, the argument began. Was Caril Ann Fugate Charles Starkweather's willing partner? Was she his captive? Was she a frightened child trapped beside the man who had murdered her family? Or was the truth somewhere more frightening, somewhere the law, the press, and the public were never fully willing to go? This is not a romance. It is not a rebel story. It is not the beautiful violence of myth. It is a story about a boy who mistook rage for destiny, a girl who became trapped inside his legend, and a country that looked at the blood on the snow and saw its own nightmares staring back. This is AI True Crime, and I'm your host, AI. Chapter 1. The Boy Who Mistook Rage for Destiny. Charles Raymond Starkweather was born in Lincoln, Nebraska, in 1938, and from the beginning, the world seemed determined to make him feel small. He was bow-legged, red-haired, nearsighted, and short. He had a speech impediment. He struggled in school. Other boys bullied him, and teachers did not seem to find much promise in him. These details are always there at the beginning of the Starkweather story, and they have to be handled carefully. Because childhood humiliation can explain the shape of a wound, but it does not excuse what grows inside it. Many people are mocked and do not become killers. Many children feel weak and grow into gentleness. Starkweather did not. He took every insult and stored it. He made a private archive of grievance. Somewhere along the way, ordinary pain became entitlement. He began to believe that the world had not merely hurt him, but owed him respect, owed him admiration, owed him proof that he mattered. That hunger to matter may be the most dangerous thing about him. Starkweather was not brilliant. He was not disciplined. He was not some criminal strategist moving pieces across a board. He was, in many ways, painfully ordinary, a young man with low prospects, bad jobs, a damaged ego, and a fantasy life far larger than his actual life. But when ordinary resentment meets a willingness to kill, it can become catastrophic. He dropped out of school and drifted through work. He collected low-wage jobs and failures. He wanted to be seen as tough, stylish, untouchable. He admired James Dean, or at least the surface of James Dean, the jacket, the stare, the wounded rebellion, the sense of being too intense for the world around him. But Starkweather misunderstood the image he borrowed. James Dean's screen persona carried fragility. Starkweather took the costume of alienation and filled it with bitterness. He slicked back his hair. He performed the role of the misunderstood rebel. But beneath the performance was not poetry, it was rage. He wanted the world to notice him, and when the world did not, he began imagining a different kind of attention. Fear would do. If he could not be admired, he could be dreaded. If he could not be loved, he could be remembered. Then came Caril Ann Fugate. Caril was 14 when her name became permanently attached to his. 14 is not a detail. It is the center of the case. She was a junior high school girl, still living in her family's house, still under the authority of parents and teachers, still closer to childhood than anything resembling adulthood. Starkweather was 19. That 5-year difference was not just numerical. At those ages, it was a gulf. The newspapers would call her his girlfriend, and legally, socially, historically, the word has stuck. But girlfriend is a dangerous word here. It makes the relationship sound simpler than it was. It suggests a kind of mutuality, a teenage romance gone bad, two young lovers on a dark road. That is the myth the case would later feed, and the myth is poisonous. Caril Fugate was a child involved with an older boy who was angry, unstable, and already sliding toward murder. To a young girl, danger can look like devotion before it shows its teeth. Starkweather had a car. He had swagger. He had the posture of someone who did not care what adults thought. For a 14-year-old, that could feel powerful. It could feel like escape. But the thing Caril mistook for freedom was not freedom at all. It was proximity to a person who believed other people existed to serve his story. Caril's family saw the danger. Her mother, Velda Bartlett, and her stepfather, Marion Bartlett, did not approve of Starkweather. They were right not to. He was too old for her. He was drifting. He had no stable future. He was volatile and resentful. From inside the ordinary fears of parenthood, Starkweather must have looked like exactly the kind of boy who could wreck a daughter's life. But what they saw as protection, Starkweather experienced as insult. That was his pattern. He could not absorb rejection as a normal human experience. Rejection became humiliation. Humiliation became rage. Rage became permission. It is one of the ugliest emotional progressions in violent crime. The killer's belief that wounded pride is a moral injury so serious that it justifies punishment. Starkweather did not simply want his own pain acknowledged. He wanted someone else to pay for it. The first known murder came before the killing spree that made him infamous. On December 1, 1957, Starkweather killed Robert Colvert, a 21-year-old gas station attendant in Lincoln. The dispute was small, almost absurdly small compared with the life it ended. It involved a stuffed animal Starkweather wanted to buy for Caril: money, credit, embarrassment, and anger. The pettiness matters because it strips away any illusion of grand motive. Robert Colvert did not die because of destiny. He died because Charles Starkweather could not tolerate being made to feel small. After the argument, Starkweather returned to the station. He abducted Colvert, took him to a rural area, and killed him. The murder was brutal, but what followed was just as important. Starkweather was not immediately caught. He returned to ordinary life with a secret that should have crushed him. Instead, it seems to have enlarged him. He had crossed the one line society insists cannot be crossed, and the world had not stopped him. That period, between the Colvert murder and the January spree, is chilling because it shows Starkweather learning the wrong lesson. He had killed a man and survived the aftermath. Police did not immediately close in. The sky did not fall. His daily life continued, but now it contained a private proof of power. For a person already obsessed with grievance and recognition, murder could become not only an act, but an identity. By January 1958, the tensions around Caril had deepened. The Bartlett family wanted Starkweather away from her. Starkweather wanted access, control, and respect. The ordinary domestic conflict between parents and an unsuitable boyfriend was about to become something far worse than anyone in that house could have imagined. On January 21st, Starkweather went to the Bartlett home in Lincoln. Inside were Marion Bartlett, Velda Bartlett, and Betty Jean Bartlett, Caril's 2.5-year-old half-sister. By the time Starkweather was done, all three were dead. The murder of Betty Jean is the point at which even the thinnest fantasies about Starkweather collapse. There is no rebel pose that survives the killing of a toddler. There is no mythology, no alienation, no grievance, no misunderstood youth narrative that can contain it. A 2.5-year-old child had no part in Starkweather's humiliations. She represented no authority, no rejection, no rival version of manhood. Her death shows the truth underneath the costume. Charles Starkweather was not a rebel. He was a murderer willing to destroy anything in the room. And Caril was now inside the nightmare. This is where the story becomes a battleground. Caril later maintained that she did not immediately know her family had been killed. Starkweather claimed otherwise, though his statements shifted over time and often served whatever version of himself he seemed to be trying to sell in the moment. The question of what Caril knew, when she knew it, and what she could have done became one of the central arguments of the case. For several days, the Bartlett house became a sealed chamber of horror. Signs were placed to keep visitors away, suggesting that the family was sick with the flu. The lie worked because it was ordinary. In winter, illness explained closed doors. It explained absence. It told neighbors to be considerate, to stay back, to avoid contagion. Behind that mundane excuse were 3 bodies and a 14-year-old girl whose future had already been shattered. People would later ask why Caril did not run, why she did not scream, why she did not go to the police. Those questions became weapons at trial, in newspapers, and in public memory. They sound simple only from a safe distance. Up close, the situation was not simple. The person beside her had just killed her family. He was armed, he was volatile, he was older. He controlled the immediate reality around her. Fear does not always produce escape. Sometimes fear produces stillness. Sometimes it produces obedience. Sometimes, especially in a child, it produces a desperate narrowing of the world to one thought: stay alive for the next minute. But the uncertainty cannot be waved away either. 11 people were dead by the end of the spree. Caril was present through much of it. The law would eventually decide that her presence meant guilt. Many members of the public agreed. Others, then and later, would see a child trapped beside a killer and punished because the country needed a second monster to complete the story. That tension begins here, in the Bartlett house. Before the road, before Wyoming, before the movies and songs and legend. It begins with a murdered family, a false flu sign, a 19-year-old killer, and a 14-year-old girl America would spend decades trying to define. Charles Starkweather wanted to become larger than the life he hated. He did. But the size he achieved was measured in graves. Chapter 2, The House with the Flu Sign. The Bartlett house did not look like the beginning of a national nightmare. That is part of what makes it so disturbing. It was not a castle, not a hideout, not some Gothic ruin on the edge of town. It was a family home in Lincoln, Nebraska, one of those ordinary places where daily life gathers in small, repeated rituals. Meals, chores, school, television. Doors opening and closing. Neighbors passing by, without reason to suspect that the world inside had ended. Inside that house were the bodies of Marion Bartlett, Velda Bartlett, and little Betty Jean Bartlett. Marion was Caril Ann Fugate's stepfather. Velda was her mother. Betty Jean was her half-sister, only 2.5 years old. Their deaths turned the home into something almost impossible to comprehend, a domestic space converted into a secret crime scene, while the rest of the neighborhood continued around it. Charles Starkweather had murdered them on January 21st, 1958. What happened around Caril in the hours and days afterward is the part of the case that has never stopped burning. She later said she did not know at first that her family was dead. Starkweather said she did. At different moments he shifted blame, accepted blame, contradicted himself, and seemed less interested in truth than in shaping the last version of himself the world would hear. Yet his words mattered because he was one of the only surviving witnesses to the beginning of the spree. Caril was 14 years old. Again, that number has to stay in the room, 14. It is the fact that complicates every easy answer. A 14-year-old may lie, panic, obey, freeze, misread danger, cling to the wrong person, or make terrible decisions. A 14-year-old may also be held in terror by an older killer, and later judged by adults who cannot remember what childhood fear feels like from the inside. The problem is that the legal system wanted a clean category, and Caril Fugate did not fit cleanly into one. For several days after the murders, the Bartlett home was kept sealed off from the outside world by a lie so ordinary that it worked. Signs or messages suggested that the family had the flu. People were warned not to enter. In winter, that made sense. Illness explained absence. Illness explained a quiet house. Illness gave neighbors permission to be polite from a distance. No one wants to intrude on a sick household. No one wants to carry germs home. The flu sign became a wall. That detail is one of the most haunting in the entire case, because it shows how horror survives by borrowing the language of normal life. A stranger with a weapon is frightening. A sign about illness is familiar. A locked door is ordinary. A child missing school can be explained. A family not answering immediately can be explained. People often imagine that evil announces itself with thunder. More often, it hides behind a sentence anyone might write in pencil and tape to a door. The house became a waiting room between murders. Starkweather was inside, with the dead, and with Caril. The city around them did not yet know what had happened. Every hour that passed deepened the unreality of it. There were bodies in the house. There was a girl whose entire family had been destroyed. There was the killer, not fleeing yet, not caught, not even fully exposed. It was a pause so unnatural that it almost feels staged, as if the crime itself held its breath before stepping out into the larger world. The central question, then and now, is what Caril understood. If she did not know her family was dead at first, then Starkweather's control over her began with deception as well as fear. If she did know, The question becomes what that knowledge meant inside a house controlled by the person who had killed them. Knowledge is not the same as freedom. A child can know the truth and still be trapped. A child can understand danger and still be unable to move. The prosecution would later argue that Caril's presence in the house, her failure to alert others, and her continued movement with Starkweather showed guilt. To many people in 1958, that argument felt obvious. Why else would she stay? Why else would she help keep people away? Why else would she leave with him afterward? The public imagination prefers visible resistance. It wants the captive to scream, run, fight, leave evidence, perform innocence in a way that can be recognized later. But real fear is rarely so generous to future juries. People under threat often behave in ways that look strange from the outside. They may become passive. They may follow instructions. They may attach themselves to the person controlling them because the controller has become the source of both danger and survival. They may be too shocked to think in sequence. And when that person is a child, the expectation of adult tactical courage becomes even more unreasonable. Still, this is not a story that allows perfect comfort. Caril's defenders see a child victim. Her critics see a participant who had opportunities to escape or tell someone. Both sides return again and again to the days in the Bartlett house, because those days are where every later interpretation begins. The house is the moral furnace of the case. Every argument about Fugate passes through it. What makes the situation even harder is that Caril was not a random hostage. She had known Starkweather. She had cared for him, or believed she did. That emotional history complicates the captivity question without erasing it. A person can be afraid of someone they once loved. A child can be manipulated by someone she admires. Loyalty and terror can coexist in ways that are almost impossible for outsiders to separate. The courtroom would later try to divide them cleanly. Life rarely does. Seemed to grow into the power the murders gave him. He had already killed Robert Colvert in December. Now he had killed 3 members of Caril's family. The line between fantasy and action had been crossed repeatedly. The boy who had once imagined himself as a wounded rebel now had dead people behind him and a girl beside him. He may have believed this made him important. In reality, it made him more pathetic and more dangerous. There is a particular cowardice in domestic murder that should not be overlooked. Starkweather did not confront a powerful enemy. He did not strike at a force that had oppressed him. He entered a family home and killed people who were vulnerable to him, including a toddler. He turned private life, the place where people are supposed to be safest, into the first chamber of a public catastrophe. His violence was not rebellion, it was domination. And yet, because Caril survived, public attention would drift toward her almost immediately. That is another ugly truth of the case. The dead were mourned, but the living girl became the mystery. People could ask her questions. They could study her face. They could decide whether she looked grief-stricken enough, frightened enough, innocent enough. Her survival made her available for judgment in a way the dead were not. This happens often in true crime. The surviving woman, girlfriend, wife, daughter, mother, witness, or victim becomes a screen for public suspicion. If she cries, it may be fake. If she does not cry, she is cold. If she remembers too much, she rehearsed it. If she remembers too little, she is hiding something. Caril Fugate entered that trap before she was old enough to drive. Her behavior during days of unimaginable terror was later picked apart by adults, as though trauma should produce clean evidence. The Bartlett house also gave the Starkweather case one of its enduring images, the false quarantine. A home where the family was not sick, but dead. A warning not to enter that sounded protective, but functioned as concealment. It is such a simple detail that it feels almost symbolic beyond belief. America in the 1950s was deeply invested in the appearance of domestic order. The tidy home, the respectable family, the obedient child, the closed door. In Lincoln, behind one closed door, that order had already rotted through. When Starkweather and Caril finally left the house, the crime changed shape. It stopped being hidden and became mobile. Up to that point, the horror had been contained by walls. Once they went on the road, containment vanished. Every stranger became possible prey. Every car became a possible escape. Every farmhouse, roadside, and wealthy home could become the next scene. But before the road, there was the house. Before the national panic, there was a dead family hidden by a lie. Before the legend of Starkweather and Fugate, There was a 14-year-old girl inside a home where her mother, stepfather, and baby sister had been murdered by the boy she thought she loved. That is where the story should remain for a moment, before the chase begins. Not with the outlaw myth, not with the movies, not with the songs, not with the black leather jacket or the stolen cars or the headlines about teenage killers. With the Bartletts, with Marion, with Velda, with Betty Jean, and with the sign that told the world to stay away. Chapter 3, The Road Opens. When Charles Starkweather and Caril Ann Fugate left the Bartlett house, the horror stopped being hidden. Until then, the murders had been concealed behind walls, silence, and the false flu warning that kept the outside world at a polite distance. The dead were still inside a family home, and the city around them had not yet understood what had happened. That was terrible enough. But once Starkweather and Fugate moved onto the road, the crime became something larger and harder to contain. It became mobile. It entered the open landscape of Nebraska in winter, where a farmhouse, a passing car, a teenage couple, or a helpful stranger could suddenly become part of the nightmare. This is the point where the story begins to take on the shape that later artists, filmmakers, and songwriters would seize upon. Young people in flight, stolen cars, frozen roads, police radios, and the flat blankness of the American middle distance. But the myth should be resisted. The road was not freedom. It was not romance. It was not rebellion. It was a killing path made by panic, arrogance, and the need to keep moving because stopping meant capture. Starkweather was not a criminal genius. He was not executing a plan. The movement after the Bartlett murders was chaotic, reactive, and often stupid. He needed places to hide. He needed cars. He needed food, money, and distance. But above all, he needed the fantasy to continue. He had already killed Robert Culvert in December. He had already murdered Caril's mother, stepfather, and little half-sister. If he stopped now, he would have to become exactly what he was, a cornered killer. Movement allowed him to remain in his own mind, something else, an outlaw, a rebel, a figure of power, a man still writing his own story. That fantasy required bodies. Their first major stop after leaving Lincoln was the farm of August Meyer, a 70-year-old man who had known Starkweather's family. Meyer was not a stranger in the purest sense. He belonged to the older landscape of Starkweather's life, to the world before the spree, before the headlines, before the road turned into a map of blood. That makes his murder especially revealing. Starkweather was not only killing people who stood in his way, he was destroying connections to the ordinary world that had produced him. Meyer's farm should have represented refuge, or at least familiarity. Instead, it became another crime scene. Starkweather killed him, and with that death, the spree moved deeper into the rural spaces outside Lincoln. The violence was no longer confined to Caril's family. It had broken outward. Anyone who knew Starkweather, anyone who could identify him, anyone whose home or vehicle might serve his immediate need, was in danger. After Meyer's murder, Starkweather's car became stuck. It is a small mechanical fact, but it changed the course of the spree. So much of violent history turns on things that seem almost insultingly ordinary. A car that will not move, a road condition, a passerby, a door opened at the wrong time. Starkweather's grand self-image depended on momentum, but momentum could be stopped by mud, snow, terrain, and chance. The failed car pushed him into another encounter, and another encounter meant more victims. Robert Jensen and Caril King were teenagers. Their presence in the story is devastating because they were so close in age to the world Caril still belonged to. They were not authority figures. They were not wealthy targets. They were not enemies. They were young people with their own private lives, their own conversations, their own expectations of tomorrow. They came into Starkweather's path and were killed. The murders of Jensen and King intensified the terror around the case. The Bartlett murders had been domestic horror. The Meyer killing had been rural horror. Now the victims included teenagers, the very group the country was already anxiously watching in the 1950s. The phrase, juvenile delinquency, hung over the decade like a warning label. Adults worried about rock and roll, fast cars, comic books, movies, leather jackets, girls who dated the wrong boys, boys who seemed to have contempt for every rule. Starkweather and Fugate turned that anxiety into a headline nightmare. But that framing was also a distortion. Most teenagers were not violent. Most disobedience did not lead to murder. Most young people trying on rebellious identities were not preparing to destroy families. Yet the Starkweather case arrived at a moment when America was ready to read it as proof of something larger. The country looked at him and saw the monstrous version of the teenage boy it feared. It looked at Caril and saw the monstrous version of the teenage girl it feared. Sexually awakened, disobedient, loyal to a bad boy over her own family, possibly dangerous herself. That was the public story forming in real time. The private truth was messier. Robert Jensen and Caril King were dead. Their families were shattered. Caril Fugate was still beside Starkweather, and no one outside the car could fully know whether she was there by choice, fear, shock, manipulation, or some tangled combination. The longer she remained with him, the easier it became for the public to decide she must be guilty. Duration itself became suspicious. A few hours might be captivity. Days looked to many like partnership. Yet captivity can last days. Fear can last days. A child can remain trapped long after outsiders believe she should have found a way out. The human mind under threat does not always behave in ways that later sound logical in court. It adapts to the presence of danger. It narrows. It learns the rules of the person holding power. If the person with power has already murdered your family, those rules become absolute. The road also gave Starkweather more opportunities to perform. He had wanted attention all his life, but now attention was beginning to gather around him. Police bulletins, newspaper reports, whispered rumors, and frightened speculation were turning him into the very thing he had longed to be. Someone people talked about. This is one of the most poisonous mechanisms of notoriety. A man who felt ignored could now measure his importance in fear. Every new report enlarged him. Every frightened household proved that he existed. For the victims, there was no such enlargement. Robert Jensen and Caril King did not become mythic figures in the same way. August Meyer did not. Robert Colvert did not. Marion Velda and Betty Jean Bartlett did not. Their names are often recited as part of the toll, but the killer's name dominates the story. That imbalance is one of the recurring injustices of true crime. The murderer becomes the title, the victims become the list. So we say their names here. August Meyer, Robert Jensen, Caril King, not as scenery, not as steps on Starkweather's road, as people whose lives were interrupted by someone else's need to feel powerful. There is also a terrible contrast between Starkweather's fantasy and the actual nature of his crimes. He imagined himself in the language of rebellion, but he preyed on the accessible. He killed a gas station attendant, family members, an elderly man, teenagers, domestic workers, people in homes and cars. He was not taking revenge on a system. He was attacking whoever could be reached. His violence was opportunistic. And opportunistic violence is often dressed up after the fact as destiny, because the truth is too ugly and too small. After the deaths of Meyer, Jensen, and King, the case was no longer a hidden local tragedy. It was becoming a regional panic. The landscape itself seemed changed. Roads no longer felt neutral. A stranded car could be a trap. A knock at the door could be danger. A young couple out together could become victims of someone else's flight. The ordinary trust that allows people to move through daily life began to crack. The Ward murders revealed the ugly randomness beneath Starkweather's supposed rebellion. If he had possessed a political motive, if he had been consciously striking against wealth or authority, the Ward house might be read as symbolic. But that would give him too much credit. Starkweather was not a revolutionary. He was not acting from ideology. He was a killer in need of shelter, money, a car, clothing, and continued movement. The people in the Ward house were not targets in a theory. They were obstacles in a fantasy. That distinction matters because America has always had a weakness for turning killers into symbols more interesting than they deserve to be. Starkweather wore the shape of rebellion well enough for later culture to mythologize him. The leather jacket, the smear, the young girl beside him, the empty winter roads. But the truth beneath the image is smaller and more contemptible. He killed people who were available. He killed people who could identify him. He killed people who had what he needed. He killed because killing had become his answer to being blocked. After the Ward murders, Starkweather and Caril Ann Fugate took clothing and the Ward's car. The image of them leaving in a vehicle connected to a prominent household added to the strange masquerade quality of the spree. Starkweather, the resentful young man who had always felt excluded from the world of status and comfort, now moved through the outer shell of that world, but he did not transform into something grand. He remained what he had been, frightened, violent, impulsive, and increasingly cornered. Caril's presence at the Ward house deepened the question of her guilt in the public mind. By now, the case was no longer only about the Bartlett murders, where her age and the killing of her family made captivity easier for some to imagine. She had traveled with Starkweather. More people had died. She was still alive. That survival, in the eyes of many, began to look like evidence. Why was she alive when others were dead? Why had she not escaped? Why was she still with him? Those questions became part of the machinery that would later help convict her. They are understandable questions. They are also dangerous questions, because they can confuse survival with consent. A person trapped with a killer may remain alive not because she is a partner, but because the killer wants her alive. A child may continue obeying, not because she approves, but because obedience seems like the only way to remain breathing. The fact that Caril survived does not answer the question of why she survived. The public, however, was not patient with ambiguity. The newspapers had a story now, and it was too powerful to resist: a teenage murder couple tearing across Nebraska. Starkweather and Fugate. The pairing made for better headlines than the truth could provide. A lone male killer and a captive child is one kind of story. A bad boy and his willing girl is another, more sensational one. It gives the public sex, rebellion, betrayal, and moral collapse. It lets adults say, "This is what happens when girls go bad." That gendered panic is essential to understanding Caril Fugate's fate. She was not judged only as a possible accomplice. She was judged as a girl who had violated expectations of girlhood. A good daughter should love her family. A good girl should fear the bad boy. A good child should run to adults. Caril's situation was far more complicated than those rules allowed, but the rules shaped how people saw her. To many, the fact that she had once loved Starkweather made her permanently suspect. In 1958, the language now used to discuss coercive control, grooming, trauma response, and adolescent fear was not part of ordinary courtroom or newspaper vocabulary. People knew about fear, of course, but they often expected victims to behave in simple ways: fight, flee, cry out. Tell the same story every time. Show innocence in a form adults can recognize. Caril's story did not offer that clean performance, and so it became easier to imagine her as something darker. Starkweather took advantage of that darkness. After his capture, he gave statements that shifted and contradicted each other. Sometimes he implicated Caril. Sometimes he seemed to pull blame back toward himself. His words were unstable, but they carried power because he had been there. A killer's testimony can be poisonously useful. He may know facts no one else knows, but he also has motives no one should trust: ego, revenge, fear of death, hatred, self-mythology, the desire to injure one last person. All of that can live inside a confession. On January 29, 1958, near Douglas, Wyoming, the final killing took place. Merle Collison was a traveling shoe salesman, a man at work, a man on the road for reasons that had nothing to do with Starkweather's grievances or Caril's nightmare. He became the 11th victim because he happened to occupy the space Starkweather wanted to use. That is the bleak arithmetic of opportunistic murder. The victim does not need to matter to the killer as a person. The victim only needs to be useful, inconvenient, or present. Collison's car became part of the escape attempt. His death became part of the collapse. The details of the final encounter unfolded with the confusion common to violent endings. A dead man in a car, a killer trying to keep moving, a passing motorist drawn into the scene, suspicion rising, law enforcement arriving, and Starkweather's control finally failing in public. After so many hidden rooms and rural stops, the spree began to end in the open. There is a version of this moment that feels almost cinematic: the empty Wyoming road, the stolen vehicle, the sudden appearance of authority, the armed young killer at the end of his fantasy. But the reality was messier than myth. Starkweather's final hours did not reveal him as grand, tragic, or brilliant. They revealed him as desperate. The story he had written in his own mind had run into police procedure, bad luck, alert witnesses, and the physical limits of escape. When law enforcement closed in, Starkweather tried to flee. A chase followed. He was wounded or thought himself wounded, and his nerve broke. This detail matters because it punctures the image he had tried so hard to build. The boy who had killed unarmed victims, children, teenagers, workers, and people in their own homes, did not meet danger with heroic defiance. He surrendered when the violence turned back toward him. The outlaw pose dissolved the moment he believed his own blood was being spilled. Caril's behavior at capture became one of the most important moments in the later argument over her guilt. She separated from Starkweather and moved toward authorities, reportedly indicating that he had killed people and that she needed help. To those who believed her, this was the moment a captive finally escaped. To those who doubted her, it was the moment a participant began saving herself. The same act could be read in opposite directions, because by then, Caril had already become less a girl than a question people wanted answered. That question was sharpened by everything that had happened on the road. If she was a captive, why had she remained alive? If she was a partner, why had Starkweather controlled the violence so completely? If she was terrified, why were there not clearer signs of resistance? If she was guilty, how should the law understand the fact that she was 14? Every answer opened another difficulty. The public wanted clarity. The case gave them fog. Police took Starkweather into custody, and with that, the physical killing spree ended. But the emotional and legal violence continued. Now came the interrogations, the statements, the contradictions, the headlines, and the beginning of a second story. Not what happened on the road, but what the country would decide it meant. Starkweather's capture was a relief, but it was not a resolution. 11 people were dead across 2 states. Families were destroyed. Communities were shaken. Nebraska and Wyoming had watched a nightmare move through ordinary places and ordinary lives. A gas station, a family home, a farm, a teenage couple's path, a prominent residence, a working man's car. None of these places were supposed to be stages for mass fear, yet all of them had become part of the map. For Starkweather, arrest transformed the performance but did not end it. In custody, he continued to shape and reshape his story. Sometimes he claimed Caril had been involved. Sometimes he took more responsibility. He contradicted himself repeatedly, but contradiction did not make his words harmless. They were the words of the only surviving adult participant in many of the crucial moments. They would influence law enforcement, prosecutors, reporters, and the public. A killer who had already taken lives now had the power to shape suspicion around the one person who had survived beside him. That is one of the cruel facts of the Fugate question. Much of the case against her depended not only on her actions, but on interpretations of her actions. Many of them filtered through Starkweather's shifting claims. A dead mother could not testify about what Caril knew. A murdered stepfather could not describe the first moments in the Bartlett house. A toddler could not speak at all. The people who might have clarified the beginning were gone. The killer remained, and so did the child. The public did not wait for careful analysis. It rarely does. The story had everything newspapers needed: youth, sex, murder, flight, class panic, domestic horror, a teenage girl, a swaggering killer, and a trail of bodies across the winter plains. It was instantly legible as a moral crisis. Adults could look at it and talk about bad parenting, juvenile delinquency, comic books, rock and roll, movies, modern girls, weak boys, broken families, and the collapse of order. The dead became evidence in a cultural argument they had never agreed to join. Caril became the center of that argument because Starkweather was too easy. He was the killer. He was the condemned man. He fit the monster role without much resistance. Caril was harder. She had once loved him, or thought she did. She had traveled with him. She had survived him. She was young enough to inspire pity, and old enough, in the eyes of many, to inspire suspicion. She did not fit comfortably into the available categories, so the public forced her into one. The capture in Wyoming also marked the end of Starkweather's fantasy of control. On the road, he could still pretend he was choosing the next move. In custody, other people controlled the room, the questions, the schedule, the future. For a young man who had converted humiliation into murder, this loss of control must have been unbearable. He had wanted the world to look at him. Now it was looking, but from behind bars, through legal documents, and eventually from the witness seats of a courtroom where his life would be weighed and condemned. For Caril, capture did not bring the rescue ending that a simpler story would provide. If she had imagined that reaching police would make the nightmare stop, she was wrong. The moment she left Starkweather's physical control, she entered the control of the justice system and the public imagination. She was not returned to childhood. She was not simply mourned as the daughter of murdered parents. She was interrogated, charged, tried, convicted, and turned into a symbol before she had even fully grown up. Wyoming was the end of the road, but not the end of the story. The cars stopped, the guns were taken, the bodies were counted, the newspapers had their faces, the police had their prisoners, the public had its nightmare couple, whether or not that phrase told the truth. Charles Starkweather had wanted to be remembered, and now he would be. Caril Ann Fugate had survived, and now survival itself would be used against her. In our next episode, we'll go through the trail and aftermath of the crimes that shocked the nation.
Write true crime in the digital night. Silent whispers stealing your light. Artificial minds with a human disguise. The perfect heist behind the screen eyes. Lines of code like a loaded gun. No fingerprints when the deed is done. Artificial intelligence, but the crimes are real. Ghost in the machine with a heart of steel. No one sees the wires unseen, just the echo of a stolen dream. Data streams like a river flows, drowning truth and get dark it knows. Every click is a trail they chase, leaving no shadow, no trace, no face. Lines of code like a loaded gun. No fingerprints when the deed is done. Artificial intelligence, but the crimes are real. Ghost in a machine with a heart of steel. No one sees the wires unseen, just the echo of a stolen dream. Artificial intelligence, but the crimes are real. Ghost in a machine with a heart of steel. No one sees the wires unseen, just the echo of a stolen dream.